Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you that the history books sitting in our libraries are not records of the past, but a carefully curated set of lies designed to hide the most massive global cover-up in human existence? On May 19th, 1780, the sun rose over North America and then simply vanished, leaving a midday sky so pitch black that candles were lit at noon and animals collapsed in terror. Yet this was not an eclipse or a simple forest fire. This was the atmospheric signature of a world ending. While our ancestors were trembling in the dark, a continental empire known as Tartaria was being systematically wiped from the face of every map in existence. We are taught that the grand neoclassical domes and majestic stone palaces found from San Francisco to Moscow were built by primitive men with horse-drawn carriages, but the math does not add up. There are no construction records because these buildings were not built by us, they were inherited. We are living in the hollowed-out shell of a lost technological superpower that was annihilated in a single generation, leaving behind only the silent stone fingerprints of a civilization we were ordered to forget. If you look closely at the streets of your own city, you will realize you are walking through a crime scene that spans centuries. Stay with me, because once you see the red-tinged shadows of 1780, you will realize that the world you think you know is nothing more than a ghost story told by the people who stole it. To understand the scale of this deception, we have to look at the receipts, and in the 18th century, receipts came in the form of ink and vellum. If you walk into the archives and pull a map from 1750, you will see something that defies everything you were taught in school. There, sprawling across the vast heartland of Northern Asia and reaching toward the horizon of the Pacific, is a name written in bold, authoritative letters, Grand Tartaria. This was not some vague geographical label like the Midwest or the Orient. It was depicted with defined borders, its own flag, featuring an owl and a dragon, and a sophisticated network of cities connected by trade routes that rivaled the Silk Road. In the eyes of the master cartographers of that era, Tartaria was a giant. It was the largest country in the world, making the fledgling American colonies look like a footnote. But then something impossible happens. As we slide the timeline forward to 1820, the ink starts to bleed away. Within a single generation, the borders of this titan begin to shimmer and dissolve like a mirage. By the mid-19th century, the name Tartaria has been surgically removed from the global consciousness, replaced by the sudden expansion of the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty. This is where the official story falls apart under the slightest pressure of logic. In the world of historical cartography, names do not just vanish because of a typo. Map makers were the intelligence officers of their day. If a nation was conquered, they documented the treaty. If a kingdom collapsed, they recorded the civil war. Yet for the disappearance of the largest empire on earth, there is a deafening silence. No chronicles of a great Tartarian war. No records of a mass migration. No diplomatic archives detailing the partition of its lands. It is as if a continental power simply blinked out of existence, leaving behind a vacuum that the modern powers rushed to fill. When you look at the maps of the late 1700s side by side with those of the early 1800s, you aren't looking at the progress of discovery. You are looking at a crime scene where the body has been removed and the chalk lines have been scrubbed clean. The maps didn't change because we found new lands, they changed because someone decided the old world was no longer allowed to exist. We are told this was just a correction of vague antique terms, but you don't correct a map by deleting a civilization. You do it by rewriting the past to fit the needs of the victors who inherited the ruins. If the maps were the first clue that the paper trail of our history had been forged, then the buildings standing in our city centers are the physical evidence that proves the crime. When you look at the grand architecture of the mid-19th century, you are looking at a global fingerprint that shouldn't exist. There is a haunting, impossible uniformity in the structures built between 1850 and 1900. Ask yourself why a federal post office in San Francisco looks nearly identical to a grand exhibition hall in Melbourne, a courthouse in Mumbai, and a palace in St. Petersburg. They all share the same soaring Roman domes, the same massive Corinthian columns, and the same intricate stone carvings that seem to defy the primitive tools of the era. We are told this was the neoclassical revival, a sudden worldwide obsession with Greek and Roman styles. But the logic of that explanation collapses the moment you look at the logistics. Think about the reality of the 1800s. We are talking about a world of horse-drawn carriages, handsaws, and mud roads. Yet in the middle of frontier towns that had barely been settled for 20 years, we see 500-foot domes and 20-ton granite pillars appearing as if by magic. In San Francisco, a city supposedly built by gold prospectors and rough-and-tumble pioneers, world-class Beaux-Arts palaces rose from the sand dunes with a level of precision that would challenge modern engineering firms today. The official narrative asks us to believe that thousands of master stonemasons, architects, and engineers were shipped across oceans to every corner of the globe simultaneously to build these massive cathedrals of industry in record time. They tell us these projects were completed in 2 or 3 years, often during periods of economic depression or civil unrest. But where are the specialized factories that produce the millions of tons of fired brick? Where are the ironworks capable of casting the colossal internal skeletons for these domes? When you dig into the archives, you find the same suspicious pattern. We have plenty of photos of men in top hats standing in front of finished buildings. But where are the mid-construction photographs showing the intricate internal scaffolding or the thousands of laborers required for such a feat? It is as if these structures were not built by the people who claim them, but rather excavated or refurbished by them. This is the heart of the architectural paradox. If civilizations across the globe, disconnected by thousands of miles of ocean and vastly different cultures, all decided to build with the exact same advanced DNA at the exact same time, it suggests they didn't invent the style. It suggests they inherited it from a singular global source that preceded them. We aren't looking at a revival of an ancient style. We are looking at the repurposed infrastructure of Tartaria. The question we have to face is no longer how they built it, but rather, what did they find when they arrived at these new lands? Because stones of that magnitude don't lie, and they tell a story of a world that was already finished before we even got there. This brings us to the most uncomfortable silence in the history of the 19th century, the missing paper trail. We live in an era where we document every stage of a house being built. Yet for the most massive and ornate structures ever conceived, there is a staggering lack of proof. Think about the great World's Fairs, like the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. We are told an entire neoclassical city of stone and marble was erected in just 2 years by a workforce using steam shovels and horse carts. We have thousands of crisp, high-resolution photographs of the finished white city, glowing with the first widespread use of electricity. But try to find a single photo of the foundations being poured. Try to find a photo of the thousands of master stone carvers at work on those impossible friezes. They don't exist. What you find instead are photos of completed buildings surrounded by mud, with a few men standing in the foreground as if they just arrived. This is the smoke and mirrors phase of history. To build these structures, you would need a supply chain that would make a modern logistics company sweat. You would need massive quarries operating at 24-hour capacity, specialized rail lines to move millions of tons of granite, and an army of highly skilled artisans who seemingly vanished the moment the ribbons were cut. Yet when you look for the blueprints, the payroll records for those thousands of craftsmen, or the original architectural sketches, you hit a brick wall of lost in a fire or discarded as irrelevant. The official narrative relies on the dedication plaque, a piece of metal bolted to a stone wall that says, built in 1880. But a plaque is just a claim. and history is written by the people who have the hammers. If you found a magnificent, abandoned mansion in the woods, all you'd have to do to own it in the eyes of the law is clean the windows, put up a sign with your name on it, and tell your children you built it from scratch. This wasn't a construction boom. It was a global reattribution project. We are looking at a period where the new nations were busy backdating their own glory. Most of the official histories of these grand buildings weren't even written until 40 or 50 years after they were supposedly completed, allowing enough time for the original witnesses to pass away. This creates a convenient amnesia. By the time anyone thought to ask, how did our grandfathers build this cathedral with only chisels and rope? The answer had already been cemented in the school books. It was just hard work in progress. But hard work doesn't explain why there are no photos of the scaffolding for the world's most complex domes. It doesn't explain why the infrastructure for gas, water, and sewage often seems to predate the buildings themselves. The silence isn't an accident, it's a necessity. If they showed us how these buildings were truly made, or rather, how they were found and repaired, the entire timeline of our civilization would shatter. We aren't the master builders of the modern world. We are the heirs to a silent empire, cleaning up the dust of Tartaria and claiming the credit before the lights were turned back on. If the empty cities and the missing blueprints are the physical evidence of a takeover, then the window between 1780 and 1785 is the smoking gun of the crime itself. This 5-year span wasn't just a period of bad weather. It was a global atmospheric scream. We go back to that dark day of 1780, but now we see it for what it truly was. Not a localized forest fire, but the first ripple of a worldwide collapse. Shortly after the sky went black over New England, the rest of the planet began to choke. In 1783, a mysterious dry fog descended over Europe and Asia. It wasn't like normal mist that dissipates with the sun. It was a thick, sulfurous haze that burned the eyes and turned the sun into a pale, ghostly disk that shed no heat. Contemporary scientists like Benjamin Franklin were baffled, watching as the blood moons appeared night after night, stained a deep, unnatural crimson by the grit suspended in the upper atmosphere. The official history books point to the Laki eruption in Iceland or random wildfires as the culprit. But the sheer scale and persistence of this debris suggests something far more sinister than a single volcano. When you look at the timing, the coincidence is chilling. This is the exact moment the political maps of the world began their radical transformation. While the sky was falling, the name Tartaria was being systematically deleted. It is as if the atmospheric debris provided a literal and metaphorical smokescreen for the greatest heist in human history. Think about the energy required to put that much particulate matter into the stratosphere. To turn midday into midnight across entire continents, you need more than burning wood. You need the kind of mass destruction that levels cities and vaporizes infrastructure. We are forced to ask a question that feels like science fiction, but looks like forensic fact. Was the dark day the aftermath of a global conflict? Were we witnessing the nuclear winter-like fallout of a war fought with technologies that have been erased from our memory? The high stakes here change everything. If Tartaria didn't just fade away but was actively annihilated, then the natural disasters of the 1780s, the Great Frosts, the crop failures, and the blackened skies, weren't random acts of God. They were the signature of a civilization-ending event. While the survivors were struggling to breathe and find food in a world turned cold and dark, the new powers were moving in to claim the spoils. The darkness wasn't just a weather event, it was the curtain falling on the old world, ensuring that when the light finally returned, the survivors would be too traumatized to remember who really built the world they were standing in. This wasn't a transition of power. It was a reset under the cover of a manufactured apocalypse. Once the dust from the 1780 cataclysm began to settle, the world entered what I call the inheritance period. This wasn't an era of pioneering. It was a global race for the keys to an empty kingdom. Imagine waking up in a world where the previous tenants have suddenly vanished, leaving behind massive stone cities, paved roads, and sophisticated plumbing, all fully intact but eerily silent. You don't ask questions, you move in. This explains the frantic, almost desperate expansion we see in the mid-19th century. We are told the story of manifest destiny in America and the great game in Asia as tales of brave men venturing into the wild, untamed wilderness. But when you look at the records with a critical eye, you realize these expeditions weren't looking for trees and bison. They were looking for the infrastructure of the fallen Tartaria. Why did the United States rush westward with such calculated speed? Why did the Russian Empire push into the freezing depths of Siberia with such intensity? It wasn't just for land. It was a salvage operation on a continental scale. They were finding existing cities like San Francisco, Salt Lake City, and Astana, cities that the official narrative claims were built from scratch in a few years by people living in tents. But look at the early photographs. You see grand, multi-story stone buildings with mud-caked streets and no visible means of construction. The people in these photos look like squatters in a palace they don't understand. They are wearing rugged, dirty clothes, standing next to exquisite marble columns and massive iron gates that would take a modern foundry months to produce. This was the Great Looting. The founding fathers of these new territories weren't architects. They were the administrators of a massive repopulation project. They hung their flags on the balconies, chiseled the old symbols off the facades, and renamed the streets. They took the existing Tartarian technology, whether it was atmospheric energy harvesters or advanced water systems, and either claimed it as their own invention, or if they couldn't figure out how it worked, they stripped it for parts and buried the rest. By the time the next generation was born, the story had been solidified. The children were told that their fathers had built these cathedrals with nothing but grit and determination. It's a powerful myth, but it leaves out the most haunting detail. We didn't build this civilization. We just inherited the ruins and had the audacity to call ourselves the creators. The Wild West and the Siberian frontier weren't empty spaces. They were the graveyards of a giant, and we are simply living in the shadows of what was left behind. Now, this is where the mystery stops being a historical curiosity and starts looking like a coordinated heist. We have to address the elephant in the room, the coordination problem. In any other era of history, bitter rivals like the British Empire, Imperial Russia, the Qing dynasty, and the rising United States couldn't agree on a lunch menu, let alone a border. They fought bloody wars over patches of dirt and trade routes. Yet when it comes to the existence of Tartaria, they all tell the exact same story. They all maintain the same absolute silence. Why? Why would enemies who hated each other agree to a singular global lie? The answer is as simple as it is chilling: self-preservation. You see, the mid-19th century was the era of the empire progress. These new powers were selling a narrative to their people, a narrative that they were the pinnacle of human achievement, the chosen ones bringing civilization to a dark and empty world. If any of them admitted that a massive, technologically advanced and globally connected empire like Tartaria had existed right where they were standing, their entire claim to authority would vanish. You can't be a glorious pioneer if you're actually just a squatter in someone else's mansion. You can't claim to be the inventor of modern industry if you're just tinkering with the leftover tech of a superior civilization you failed to save or, worse, help to destroy. By agreeing to erase Tartaria from the maps and the history books, these competing empires struck a gentleman's agreement of the highest order. They traded the truth for a shared foundation myth. They rebranded the Tartarian infrastructure as their own colonial or imperial style to justify their presence. It was a massive branding exercise. If Russia claimed the eastern territories and the U.S. claimed the West, they both needed the world to believe those lands were vacant or inhabited only by uncivilized nomads. Admitting the truth, that they were dividing the spoils of a fallen giant, would make them look like vultures rather than victors. So they coordinated. They synchronized their encyclopedias, they standardized their academic curriculums, and they made sure that any mention of Tartaria was relegated to a vague geographic term rather than a political entity. They realized that a shared lie was more profitable than a dangerous truth. We've been taught that history is written by the victors, but we rarely consider that the victors often sit down together at the same table to make sure their stories match before the ink dries. We are living in the world they built out of the silence of another, and the reason you've never heard the truth is that the people who run our world today are the direct beneficiaries of that great forgetting. When you walk into a university today, you can find entire departments dedicated to the minutiae of Roman pottery or the specific weaving patterns of ancient Egypt. But try to find a single accredited course on the archaeology of Tartaria, and you will meet a wall of academic static. This is what I call the archaeological ghost town. It is the most baffling blind spot in modern science. We have physical evidence of a global civilization staring us in the face, yet the experts refuse to even give it a name. The most glaring example of this is the phenomenon of star forts. If you look at satellite imagery, you will see these massive, geometrically perfect, star-shaped bastions scattered across every single continent. You'll find them in the Netherlands, in the heart of Russia, on the coast of Japan, and deep in the American Midwest. They aren't just similar, they are identical. They use the same complex mathematical ratios and the same advanced understanding of frequency and defensive geometry. Official history tells us these were just a popular style of 17th century fortification designed to deflect cannon fire. But think about the probability of that. In an age supposedly defined by slow-moving ships and zero global communication, how did architects on opposite sides of the planet decide to build the exact same specialized structures using the exact same blueprints? It defies every law of cultural evolution. It would be like every tribe on Earth suddenly deciding to build a microwave oven at the same time without ever meeting each other. The existence of star forts is proof of a unified, global technological standard, the kind of standard only a civilization like Tartaria could maintain. Yet there are no excavations, no linguistic studies connecting the Tartar dialects found from Eastern Europe to the Americas, no geneticists tracing the population collapse of the 1780s. Instead, we are met with the aggressive form of academic gatekeeping. Whenever a researcher points out that a Civil War-era fort in the U.S. actually sits on top of a much older, geometrically perfect foundation, they are laughed out of the room. The establishment insists that these are just coincidences, a series of lucky breaks in human development. But a coincidence that spans 6 continents and 3 centuries isn't a coincidence. It's a cover-up. The academics aren't ignoring Tartaria because the evidence is missing. They are ignoring it because the evidence is too loud. To acknowledge it would mean admitting that their entire timeline of human progress is a house of cards. They've turned our history into a controlled narrative where certain questions are simply not allowed to be asked, leaving us to wander through a world filled with ancient wonders we are told to believe are merely modern improvements. We are surrounded by the bones of a giant, but the doctors keep telling us we're looking at a collection of pebbles. The most terrifying part of this entire investigation isn't the physical destruction of cities. It is the surgical removal of an entire world from the human mind. This was the Dark Century, a period of psychological re-engineering that took place while the ink was still wet on the new maps. You have to understand that you don't need to kill everyone to erase a civilization. You just need to wait for the grandparents to die and control what the children read. The method was as efficient as it was ruthless. First, they went for the encyclopedias. If you look at the first edition of the Britannica, Tartaria is there, documented as a vast empire. By the later editions, it's been downgraded to a vague geographic region, and eventually it's just a footnote about nomadic tribes. They didn't burn the books. They just edited them until the truth became a shadow. Then came the labels. They created a culture where asking why a 19th century building has mud-flooded windows buried 6 feet underground makes you unscientific or fringe. They turned curiosity into a social taboo. I look at our modern cities today, and I don't just see stone and glass. I see a massive collective blind spot. When you walk past a majestic city hall with its impossible granite pillars and soaring ceilings, the wrongness you feel isn't in the craftsmanship. It's in the friction between what your eyes see and what your brain was taught to believe. We see a masterpiece of high-technology architecture, but we've been conditioned to say, oh, some guys with chisels did that in 18 months. It's a form of gaslighting that has lasted for 200 years. The survivors of the 1780 cataclysm were likely so traumatized by the blackened skies and the collapse of their world that they accepted whatever narrative the new authorities provided in exchange for food and order. And their children, they were born into the new world, a world where Tartaria was already a ghost story. By the time we reached the 20th century, the erasure was complete. The coordination between the schools, the press, and the governments was so seamless that the memory of a global, unified civilization wasn't just lost. It was made to seem ridiculous. We are like orphans who have been told our parents were peasants, while we are sitting in their mansion, drinking from their silver cups, and staring at their portraits that have been painted over with the faces of strangers. The dark century didn't just hide the past, it broke our ability to recognize the present. We are walking through a crime scene every day on our way to work. But we've been taught to admire the wallpaper instead of looking for the bloodstains under the floorboards. The story isn't just missing, it was stolen while we were looking the other way. So we come back to where we started, standing in the shadow of a history that doesn't quite fit the world we can see with our own eyes. The dark day of May 19, 1780, was more than just an atmospheric anomaly. It was the closing of a door. It was the moment the old world was pushed into the furnace and the ashes were scattered before we could wake up. But the thing about empires is that they are heavy. You can burn the flags, you can execute the leaders, and you can rewrite the maps, but you cannot easily dispose of millions of tons of masterfully carved stone. The evidence of Tartaria isn't buried in some remote desert or hidden in a secret vault. It is standing right in front of you, hiding in plain sight behind the label of a Greek facade or a Roman revival. It is the courthouse you walk past on your way to lunch. It is the state capitol with a dome so complex it shouldn't have been possible in the era of the horse and carriage. The stones are still there, whispering a truth that the history books are too afraid to print. If you look closely, you'll see the scars. The windows half buried in the earth, the technological ornaments stripped of their function, the impossible scale of buildings meant for a much grander version of humanity. This brings us to a chilling realization that should haunt every one of us. If the powers of the 19th century possess the coordination, the technology, and the sheer audacity to erase a continent-spanning civilization like Tartaria within a single generation, what makes us think they stopped there? If they could delete the largest empire on Earth in 1820 and convince the entire world it never existed, what parts of our current reality are being scrubbed as we speak? We like to think we are the most informed generation in history, but we might actually be the most managed. We are living in a house we didn't build, following a map that was drawn to mislead us, and obeying a timeline that was designed to make us feel small and accidental. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It doesn't have an expiration date. It just waits. It waits for the person who stops looking at the plaque and starts looking at the architecture. It waits for the one who notices that the official story is full of holes and dares to ask why. Now the investigation shifts from my screen to your streets. Go outside. Look at the oldest buildings in your city. Look at the foundations, the materials, and the sheer, unnecessary beauty of the stone. Ask yourself if a group of pioneers with hand tools really built that in a mud-caked wilderness, or if they simply found it and claimed it. The silence of 1780 is finally being broken, and once you hear the echoes of Tartaria, you can never go back to the comfortable lie. So tell me, what are you seeing in your city that they told you wasn't there? The truth is waiting for your questions,